Today, we'll be exploring Variations 7, 8, and 9 with Dan Tepfer, a jazz pianist. Although we know Bach best as a composer, in his own time, he was best known as a performer. In particular, he was renowned as a virtuosic organist and an improviser capable of magic.
I'll tell you one thing. Bach was a bad boy.
That's Jeff Scott, hornist for the groundbreaking wind quintet, Imani Winds.
Yeah, one of the greatest jazz musicians alive right now, if he were alive. The chops that guy had. You'd be talking about Louis Armstrong, Bach. You know?
This is the amazing organist James Kibbe playing Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Bach's contemporaries marveled at his playing, describing how Bach's fingers would run over the keys, how when playing the organ, Bach's feet would fly over the pedals. As a conductor, Bach could keep track of multiple instruments at the same time, all while playing his own complex part and cueing musicians for their entrances. One contemporary described Bach when he performed as, quote, full of rhythm in every part of his body. Two episodes reveal Bach's mastery of music and improvisation. Just so you know, I'm going to start by giving a bit of context for the first episode. Stick with me. When Bach was just shy of 15, he and his friend Georg Erdmann, also a musician, dropped out of school in Ohrdruf and trekked nearly 200 miles north to the town of Lüneburg, close to Hamburg. It seems they were escaping to more fertile pastures, at least musically speaking. At the very least, it underscores the strength of Bach's willpower that he would undertake such a long journey as a teenager. The boys quickly found scholarships in the semi-professional choir of St. Michael's School. Before long, though, Bach's voice broke, and he could no longer earn his keep as a chorister. Instead, he began to study with Georg Bohm, a virtuoso organist and composer in town, who took Bach under his wing and into his home to live. Bohm exposed Bach to a new style of organ playing, the North German tradition, which was known for its drama, flair, and improvisational flights of fancy. One of the most famous practitioners was Bohm's teacher, the organist Adam Reinken. You're listening to the Dutch organist Sietse de Vries, playing from Reinken's choral fantasy based on the hymn An Wasserflüssen Babylon. Bach may have met Reinken as a teenager when studying with Bohm, but the most famous meeting came 20 years later, by which time Bach had come into his own as an organ virtuoso. In the St. Catherine Church in Hamburg, Bach played for the great master, then 97 years old, for more than 2 hours, improvising on this piece that you're hearing. It may sound kind of somber or staid, but according to one of Bach's contemporaries, Bach's improvisations were something to behold. He imbued Reinken's music with new life, played with the ideas Reinken first conceived, and introduced new ones. Forgive the weird analogy, but it's like a brilliant home decorator who comes into your house, looks at the spaces you see every day and finds a totally new way to arrange the furniture. Finds that just adding a different color here, or a new pillow there, or a bright bouquet of flowers in one hall changes the essence of the space. Or maybe more contemporary, it's like Lin-Manuel Miranda taking Rob Chernow's already masterful biography of Alexander Hamilton and making it into the rap musical Hamilton on the spot. Reinken was deeply moved by Bach's ingenuity and his development of the North German tradition. After the performance, he told Bach, "I thought that this art was dead, but I see that in you it still lives." The second time Bach demonstrated his prowess as an improviser was when he met Frederick the Great of Prussia in 1747. This was late in Bach's life, just 3 years before he died. By that time, one of Bach's sons, Carl Philipp Emanuel, was working for the king as a court musician. The king invited Bach to come play for him in Potsdam. Upon Bach's arrival, the king presented him with a short sequence of notes, the subject for a fugue upon which Bach was to improvise. This was the line Bach got. Bach's task was to take this line and somehow repeat it in 3 different voices, while also doing interesting, complementary things in the other 2 voices. If you play a keyboard instrument, you may know how hard it is just to improvise over a set of chords. Improvising on a fugal subject is taking it to the next level, because it's way more specific than a set of chords. It's a set of notes, which you have to think up harmonies to fit around as they pass through different registers of the keyboard. It's like being asked to write a scene of a play with 3 different people, where you have to give each actor their lines in real time as they talk over each other, making sure that 3 people keep repeating what the others said, while also having a sensible, normal conversation. Unfortunately, there's no way to know exactly what Bach did with the theme that the king gave him at the time, but apparently it left everyone in the audience seized with astonishment. What we do have is the musical offering, a piece based on the same theme, with elaborate puzzles woven throughout, which Bach sent to the king after his visit. This is a taste of the musical offering. You'll start by hearing the same line as before, and then listen to see how it gets passed around. The second voice is about to enter. And now the third voice. It still blows my mind to think about the brain power required to improvise in the way that Bach could, which is why it blew my mind to talk to Dan Tepfer, a jazz pianist who improvises on the Goldberg Variations.
So my project Goldberg Variations, I play all 30 of Bach's Goldberg Variations. I perform them from memory as they're written, and after each one, I improvise a variation of my own.
For each variation, Tepfer creates something new that borrows characteristics of the variation.
I guess what I'm looking for is some kind of essence of each variation. Like, what is it that makes it stand out as being different from the other variations? What is it that gives it an identity? Because, you know, the central challenge of the Goldberg Variations, and this is the challenge that Bach obviously was faced with, is that you have to make 30 different pieces with the same harmonic structure. And that's really quite a tall order. 30 is a lot.
Across Tepfer's improvisations, one aspect is always consistent, the harmonic structure, which remains faithful to the overall harmonic structure of the Goldberg Variations. Even when what you're hearing sounds nothing like the variation you just heard, the underlying harmonic changes are the same. It's what's going on around them or between them that's different.
If you think about someone like John Coltrane, one of the great jazz musicians and innovators, the reason he wrote such challenging music in the kind of middle phase of his career, I think, is because it forces you to concentrate as a performer. And when the performer is forced to concentrate, there's some kind of electricity about it. There's something that really speaks to the audience. There's something that gives it a sense of danger and excitement, or importance, shall we say. And it forces me to focus, and it brings everything very sharply into the present. And I really enjoy that challenge.
I wanted to know why Tepfer decided to improvise on the Goldberg Variations. If you check out his other projects, he clearly has an affinity for Bach. For one recent project, #Bach Upside Down, Tepfer trained a computer program to listen as he plays a piece of Bach music, then flip the voices and play them back to him as he sits and dances mesmerizingly to the new music. But still, where did this riff on the Goldberg Variations come from?
I think it was 2008, something like that. I was on a big tour in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia doing free improvisation solo concerts. This was organized by the State Department. And to get up on stage every night and do free improvisation is very exhausting. And so one night I just thought, geez, I need to find something to inspire me. And I decided to play a couple of the Goldberg Variations. I'd start with one of the variations, and then I'd just do a long free improvisation, very unstructured, and just kind of using the Goldberg variation that I played as a starting point. And I found that to be incredibly helpful.
That spontaneous idea that Tepfer had while on tour became a project that he developed over many years, learning all of the variations and how to improvise over them. When Tepfer speaks about improvisation, even though it's in a different lingo, it reminds me of Bach.
Well, I've been playing now for 12 years with one of the great masters of jazz improvisation, Lee Konitz. And he has this great quote. He says, if you're really going to improvise, you got to be prepared to be unprepared. And that requires a lot of preparation. And it's this kind of Zen koan phrase, but it's actually very true, which is simply that if you're actually going to commit to improvising, as in not just pretend to be improvising, but actually inventing music in the moment that it's being played in front of an audience, you basically have to be very fluent in the language.
Bach was fluent in the musical language of his time. His ability to improvise, whether on the King of Prussia's weird chromatic line or Reinken's chorale variations, came from his deep understanding of music. He was an amazing improviser and performer because he was an intense student of music.
The whole training of a jazz musician, which takes years obviously, is to be able to spontaneously express oneself over a set harmonic structure. So that's exactly what we're doing in the Goldberg Variations.
As we move to talking about the variations, I have a disclaimer. This could get a bit confusing for non-musicians. I'll try my best to make things clear, but stick with me because I think you'll find Tepfer fascinating. Variation 7, which is what you're hearing, is written for 2 voices and is one of only 3 variations where Bach actually wrote in a tempo marking, al tempo di giga, in the tempo of a jig.
It's one of the few in the whole set where my feeling of what's at the core of it is primarily kind of an emotional image. I always get this image with this one of 2 teenagers, young people at a dance, and they're dancing together for the first time. I just think one hand is one person and the other hand is another person, and they're kind of shy, and they're just getting to know each other. And obviously it has this thematic element. That is really kind of the backbone of it thematically.
That thematic figure, like a little skip or a hop in the dance step, repeats throughout the variation, including in the second half. Let's talk about Variation 8, which feels completely different.
This is a really interesting variation. I mean, it's one of the more interesting ones rhythmically because it's written in 3/4, but there are two figures that are at the core of it.
Tepfer's going to describe two different patterns that appear in this variation. One is in 3/4, as he said, meaning that it sounds like it belongs in a piece with 3 beats to the bar, like a waltz. He describes this pattern as an arpeggiation pattern, which is just a fancy way of saying it's playing the notes in a chord, one note at a time.
There's this filigree pattern, this is kind of arpeggiation pattern that goes... And, obviously that gets modified in all kinds of different ways, like... things like that. But ultimately what it is an arpeggiation pattern that's very clearly in 3/4. There's 4 of those notes, of those 16th notes in each of the beats of 3/4. So you're like 1, 2, 3, and daka, 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 right? Mm-hmm. But then the other figure goes... And that feels very much like it's in 6/8, because those are 8th notes.
6/8 is another way of feeling the beats in the measure. Instead of feeling 3 large beats, you feel 6 small beats, which actually group into 2 larger beats. Tepfer's going to count in 2, but really he's counting in 6/8.
So it feels like 1, 2, 1, 2, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2.
Tepfer's saying that even if you don't realize it, your ear is picking up on 2 different ways of counting this variation. One figure, the one in the treble, feels like it's divided into 3 beats per measure, and the other figure in the bass feels like it's divided into 6 little beats, which end up feeling like 2 big beats. So the performer's faced with a choice. Do you perform it in one of those different ways of counting, like just in 3/4?
Or you can actually go kind of with the duality of it and understand that I think Bach was probably excited about this duality where these two things are actually coexisting, which, is interestingly, it's a very like Afro-Cuban idea, and the thing is, it's not actually an either or. And I think that's just, to me, it's very transparently what Bach is getting at here. And it's quite a radical idea, really.
So it's either 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or it's 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1. Or it's both. Whew, that was harder than I expected to record. Let's get on to Variation 9.
So Variation 9 is the 3rd canon in the Goldberg Variations, and it's a canon at the 3rd. So that means that whatever melody gets played in the first canonic voice gets repeated in the next bar a 3rd lower. He's got 2 voices doing the canonic thing, as in, there's the first one that states a melody and the second one repeats it later, either transposed or not if it's at the unison. And then there's a 3rd voice that's just a free voice, and it's supporting everything else that happens.
As in earlier variations, the bass voice is doing its own thing, while still outlining the chords at the heart of the piece.
When I'm improvising over the canons, some of them I actually improvise a canon at the interval, but I find that improvising a canon at the 3rd is really a challenge in terms of making it work. And I can do it, but it always feels a little contrived. When I improvise on this one, the idea that I have in my head is like, okay, I'm using the harmonic structure, of course, and I'm going to use the same rhythmic world as Bach, and I'm going to just use thirds.
This is from Tepfer's improvisation on 9, which you'll hear more of very soon.
When you talk about the harmony of the Goldberg Variations, you could argue that it's...
You heard these changes before, but we're going to go somewhere different.
So that's the first half. You could argue that it's those changes, but Bach obviously at several moments does not think about it that way. He thinks of it really as a baseline, He thinks of it as a baseline that can then actually accommodate a much wider range of harmonic ideas above it.
Variation 9 is one instance in which Bach took a slightly different harmonic path.
The second half of the Goldbergs goes...
So these are the standard changes in the second half.
He actually inserts a Neapolitan sixth into the resolution to E minor.
A Neapolitan sixth, by the way, is a major chord built on the lowered second note of a scale. So in the key of E minor, where this Neapolitan occurs, the Neapolitan is an F major chord, which is not something that Bach has used in prior variations.
And that really sticks out. So it's... So right there. So it goes, that's the Neapolitan sixth. Okay, so that's a pretty common move in classical music, but it's not, part of the kind of standard changes in the Goldbergs. It doesn't frequently occur there.
Okay, at risk of seriously boring people who aren't interested in music theory, the question is why Bach used a special chord instead of just sticking to the normal changes.
So this is why he needs to change the harmony in that whole section. Most of the harmony in the Goldbergs moves in a stepwise fashion.
Stepwise just means that the bass line is walking up or down one step at a time, instead of leaping between notes. If
you think about how the harmony moves in the Goldbergs, like the beginning, it's stepwise, right? Right? So as long as it moves stepwise, then this canon at the third works because you're waiting for two chords. So by the time the next chord comes, it's actually a third away.
The logic is this. If you start at one note and you walk down 2 steps, you've got a third. So just wait for 2 steps in the bass line, which is the same as 2 chord changes, and you can enter with the second voice.
You would expect a melody that worked on the first chord, let's say like, to not work on the second chord. But once we get to the third chord, expect it to work because it's a third away, right? But at the beginning of the second half, you have D7, G to C. Okay, so the third chord is actually just a step away from the first chord.
In other words, the chord of C is just a step below the chord of D7, not a third below, which is what you'd want.
So you don't have that third movement. And so instead of going to C there, he does something pretty interesting. He goes, he actually resolves to G major. And then very quickly you realize it's E minor. And then the B7 and resolves immediately to E minor, which is really different from what the original chord changes. The original chord changes go. They take longer.
In other words, Bach is accelerating the harmonic progression to ensure that the canon works.
Yeah, he definitely had to do some negotiating to make this work. But that's part of the beauty of the Goldbergs is, as we were saying, these destinations are non-negotiable. He's got to get to E minor, but how he gets there is fluid.
This is what people mean when they talk about Bach as a kind of puzzle master. Because he was writing music with very strict requirements, he had to find ingenious ways to satisfy the requirements while still making something beautiful.
Goldberg Variations are entirely about constraints. You know, that's really what they're about. It's about Bach negotiating some very tough constraints with incredible grace.
Thanks for bearing with me. The point, ultimately, of going through that analysis was to show how Bach had to improvise, in a sense, to stay within the parameters of the system he created. And now Tepfer explores those same parameters and tries to find a path through. Here's Tepfer's take on Variations 7, 8, and 9. Thanks for listening. In this episode, you heard lots of music played by Dan Tepfer, but also the music of Adam Reinken, played by organist Sietse de Vrij. And Bach organ music played by James Kibbe. I also want to thank David Schreiberg, my editor, whose advice throughout this project has been essential. Join us next time for a brief detour into the land of harpsichords. Let me tell you, it's a land with all sorts of features I had no idea existed. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.